purpose of the clinic really is just to open the floor for any and all questions. So it's completely unscripted, organic conversation about all things clinical evaluation. Hopefully it's a useful platform just for an exchange of ideas. It's really any and all questions. There's a lot of claims out there in the world, lots of people claiming to be experts about clinical evaluation, but at Mantra Systems we thought we needed to offer a bit of proof of that. So, we're hoping that we're able to answer your questions and that it will be a useful afternoon. So we've scheduled for between half an hour and 45 minutes. Sometimes we run over that, sometimes we don't, but it really just depends on the number of questions. And we often have people joining the call as we make a start. But without further ado, we'll get on to the first questions.
Okay, so we've had a few in by email already. So first one is, when writing a CER under a tight deadline, which sections should I write first?
Okay, so this is obviously somebody who's got some level of familiarity with the volume of work that's involved in doing clinical evaluation properly. So things have changed a bit under the MDR in terms of expectations, but specifically in relation to certain sections. And really, that's the sections that involve a literature review. So certainly the clinical background, the state-of-the-art literature review, which is an essential part, because that's where you get your safety and performance benchmarks from, is take up the lion's share of the time. And so if you're under a tight deadline, that's the one to do first. So focus on the clinical background and state-of-the-art literature review first. And that's especially if it's your own product, so you're familiar with the product, because some of the other sections about product details and so on are likely to be more time effective, especially if you have access to an effective structure for those sections of the CER. So yeah, clinical literature, clinical background, state-of-the-art first, and then you can start with the device-specific sections after that.
The same person already sent in the next question as well, which is, what is the best way of demonstrating a favourable benefit-risk profile in a clinical evaluation?
Yeah, so benefit-risk profile is one of the four major objectives of clinical evaluation under the MDR. So there are four main things that you're setting out to demonstrate. That is that the device is suitable for its intended purpose, that it conforms with the relevant general safety performance requirements, that it performs in line with safety and performance benchmarks which are derived from comparable alternative devices, and that it has a favourable benefit-risk profile. So how do you show benefit-risk profile is the question. Well, the first thing is to understand how to express benefits. So ideally, benefits are quantifiable. So you can put a number against a benefit. So rather than saying a benefit is that it reduces pain, what ideally you should be able to get from the review of clinical literature related to the device is that, for example, it reduces a pain VAS score by a certain number. So you have a more concrete, quantifiable benefit that's been demonstrated in clinical evidence. Remember, benefits don't have to just be direct clinical parameters like that. It could be a benefit in terms of more efficient provision of healthcare, or it could be a cost benefit, or it could be a benefit in terms of reducing waste. So all of those are legitimate benefits under through the lens of the MDR. So accumulate evidence to demonstrate a benefit first of all, but at the same time you need to demonstrate that risks have been robustly assessed. So the last time we did the clinic, there was a question about the timing of everything. You need to do your risk management files properly before attempting a clinical evaluation, because an output of your risk management files will be an input to this part of the clinical evaluation. So a thorough overview of risks. And what you're really looking for is to show that all of the risks are acceptable when judged against predetermined criteria. So if you can do that, if you can show that you have demonstrable benefits and all of your risks are acceptable against defined criteria, then you have an argument that the benefit risk profile is favourable. But if you're not able to demonstrate clear benefits and or you haven't properly assessed or analysed risks and assessed them against predetermined criteria, it's going to be more difficult. So it partly comes down to a thorough literature review, clear delineation of benefits, and an effective risk analysis. what we often find on these sessions is that some people come just to listen, but it is just an open, friendly forum. So just fire out any questions that you may have, and we'll see if we can address them. Common themes of questions relate to structure, relate to timeline. How do you actually start? And if questions don't come in a minute or two, then I can address some of the common questions that we get in these settings. I'll just pause for a minute. I should mention I've had a bit of a throat infection recently, so apologies if I'm clearing my throat or so on. Okay, so no more questions coming through at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to address some of the common themes of questions that we get. One is about structure. So the types of questions we get is, how can you be confident that a clinical evaluation report is correctly structured? So you need an outside framework to work with, and previously the go-to place for that was the MedDev guideline, which the catchy title MedDev 2.7/1 revision 4. So if you're not familiar with MedDev, these are a set of guidelines that were published by the Commission to help medical device manufacturers meet the previous legislative standard, which was the Medical Device Directive. So the MedDev 2.7/1 revision 4 was quite a comprehensive document, and it was really the go-to place to understand structure for CER. The problem is it hasn't been updated for the MDR. The other problem is it's not actually very easy to work with. It's very much a dry technical document, and that, coupled with the fact that it's not been updated for the MDR, means it's no longer so reliable as a source of information in terms of structure. So other sources that might be useful to know about are the MDCG guidelines, the Medical Device Commissioning Group guidelines. And so MDCG 2020-13 is actually a template for a clinical evaluation report assessment form. In other words, this is almost the mark sheet that you can expect a notified body to use when assessing a clinical evaluation report. So it's very handy to have access to it. If you were doing an exam and you had access to a mark sheet, you go to it every day of the week. So it's definitely worth looking at. It's not as detailed as the MedDev guideline, but it is at least up to date by virtue of the fact that its prefix is 2020. So it was written for the MDR standard. So that's definitely worth having access to. If you have a device that has already been in market and accredited under the MDD, you should also have a look at MDCG 2020-6, which is a guideline for legacy devices. And a legacy device is any device that was accredited under the MDD. So that's also worth knowing about. And there is an MDCG guideline for equivalence, which is much more difficult under the MDR, which we can talk about if anybody's looking to claim equivalence for a device. That's 2020-5. So there are some kind of official external guidelines. Then the other thing we get asked about are CER templates. Can you use a template to write a CER? Templates they can be a little bit limited. There's some very good ones out there. There are some free ones out there. The problem with templates is that some of them aren't up to date, and many of them will give you a basic framework, but they won't help you with things like the style of language to use. They won't give you any examples to try and illustrate how it should look, how a section should look. So we went ahead and developed a template that is just an alternative to our CER services. This is really for people who have some confidence in medical writing, don't necessarily want to outsource the whole process, but just need to know that what they're producing will definitely meet with the requirements. So our template is 64 pages long, to put that in context, and it gives a load of examples of how to phrase things along with basic structure. So templates, MDCG guidelines, and MedDev guidelines are external sources that you can use to try and make sure that your CERs are up to standard. But many people that work with us choose to outsource the process to us because they're not necessarily certain that they have either the capacity or the experience to align with MDR standards. So that's one common question we get about structure. Is anyone on the call looking to claim equivalence to another medical device? So not seeing anybody who's looking to claim it. Oh, we do have somebody who's looking to claim equivalence. Okay, so equivalence under the MDR is a little bit different to equivalence under the MDD. So for anyone who's not aware, the process of equivalence is basically where instead of accumulating clinical evidence about the subject device, you make an argument that the device is so similar to another device that's already on the market that you can essentially piggyback on that other device's clinical evidence. And so this has the advantage that it can save a huge amount of money and time in terms of developing clinical evidence for your own device. This was really popular under the MDD, but as I said before, it's much more complicated under the MDR. It is possible. We've successfully, on behalf of clients, made equivalence submissions, but it has to be handled with really great care. So the first thing to say is that if you have a class 3 device, then there's a requirement that you have a contract in place giving you full unfettered access to the equivalent device's technical files. So essentially, if you're claiming equivalence to a competitor's device and your device is class 3, to all intents and purposes, it's a dead duck. Forget it, because no competitor's ever going to give you a contract giving you full access to the technical files. Class 2A, or all three other classes, actually, you don't need a contract in place. What you need to demonstrate, first of all, or one of the things you need to demonstrate, is that you have a sufficient level of access to information about the device. And this is where the skill comes in forming an argument. So we'll return to that in a moment. What information do you need access to, or what are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to show that the device is equivalent in 3 domains: technical characteristics, biological characteristics, and clinical characteristics. And you have to show equivalence in all 3 domains. So technical might be how the device is used, how a user interacts with it, what buttons you press, what programs it has, whatever it is, depending on the type of the device. Biological characteristics are about things like biocompatibility, substances in contact with human tissues. What tissues are they in contact with? How long are they in contact with them for? And then clinical characteristics, what are its target medical conditions? In what clinical context does it use? What patient population does it address? So formally, under the Medical Device Directive, you could actually have a subject device, and you could have multiple equivalent devices that would contribute part of that picture. So you could essentially have a menu of equivalent devices that collectively would show equivalence. Under the MDR, rather, you can no longer do that. So an equivalent device has to be equivalent in all those domains. You can have more than one equivalent device, but each of them must be equivalent in all those domains in order to be valid. The other thing to bear in mind is the equivalent device has to be approved under the MDR. So you can't claim equivalence to a device that still has accreditation under the MDD, or that only has accreditation under the MDD. That won't be sufficient. So when we return to our previous point about sufficient access to data, you need sufficient access to data to plug any uncertainty in any of those characteristics. So it might be that you can use publicly available information to address maybe the technical characteristics and the clinical characteristics, but you need access to information about the device to address the biological characteristics. And really what you're trying to show is a comparison between your device and the equivalent device, and then a comment on whether that's likely to have an impact on the device's safety and performance. So they're the overall criteria, and then you make a summation as to whether or not you feel that the requirements for equivalence have been met. So just a sub-question that come through: do you know companies that have been successful at claiming equivalence for software as a medical device? Well, yeah, software as a medical device is a really important space. There's a huge number of programs now that will be classed as a medical device, a lot of apps and so on. So it's a really quickly growing area. But although there are obviously differences between software and the physical medical device, through the eyes of the regulation, they're actually treated very similarly, or your base position should be that it should be quite similar. So yes, we are aware of successful equivalence claims for software as a medical device, but there are obviously differences here. For example, it may have no biological characteristics. It may not have any contact with a patient. It's software. So you just have to work around the requirements that are stated. And there is a subsection in 2020-5 that deals with software as a medical device that will be worth looking at. Somebody else on the call said their device is class 2B. You need to tread very carefully with 2B. It is possible. You don't need a contract necessarily, but you do need to demonstrate you have a really strong level of access to data. It may be safer to have a contract for 2B. So it's certainly worth exploring whether or not equivalence is the most secure route for a class 2B device because of the level of scrutiny. And again, that's the sort of thing that we can offer as a consultancy service. Is it a viable route or not? That can be a lot more cost effective than going ahead with a full evaluation that perhaps might fail at the back end.
Another question. Is it necessary to perform a literature review under MDR if you are not claiming equivalence?
Yes. So a literature review is, absolutely essential under the MDR. It's one of the bits that's really attained prime importance, whether you're claiming equivalence or not. The reason for that is that a primary purpose of a clinical evaluation is to demonstrate that the device functions in line with safety and performance benchmarks derived from alternatives that are intended to do the same or a similar thing. So if you have a hip implant, a major thing you have to do is accumulate evidence about other hip implants that are similar to yours. And you might be looking for benchmarks such as implant survivorship, pain levels in patients or function levels in patients at certain timeframes after implantation. So you accumulate data about comparable alternatives. Then later on, you accumulate data about yours and you make a comparison. That's still necessary for software, and it's still necessary in the absence of a claim of equivalence, because the only thing equivalence is doing is it's removing the need for clinical data about the subject device and replacing it with clinical data about the equivalent device. But you still need to do a literature review about clinical background. And even if you make an equivalence claim, you still need to do a literature review against the equivalent device. So it has to either be subject device or equivalent device. And it always has to be about clinical background and state of the art as well. So really, a clinical evaluation involves 2 literature reviews.
The question on the chat. As I understand you, when my Class 2A device is registered as MDR compliant, anybody can claim equivalence to it when they want to demonstrate MDR compliance without having access to any technical documentation. Is this correct?
I suppose theoretically it's correct, although it's worth returning to my earlier proviso, which is that what I was saying is that equivalence is possible under the MDR. That doesn't necessarily mean it's reliable or even the best route. Claiming equivalence under the MDR is not easy. Most equivalence claims will fail. And so a competitor will be better off accumulating evidence about their own device. And it's not, generally speaking, the most secure of routes to rely on equivalence. And actually, it's worth bearing in mind that these changes were brought in because there was a position of absurdity under the MDD. You had manufacturers of devices who were saying in their marketing material, our device is completely unique and is better than anything else out there on the market. And in their regulatory documents were saying our device is exactly the same as our competitors. That's absurd. So the MDR, essentially one of its purposes has been to say we're not having that situation anymore. Unless the device really is equivalent in all of these 3 domains and they have a sufficient level of access to really prove that, then we're not interested. So for your 2A device, presumably you have things, if it contacts the patient, you may have, for example, biocompatibility reports that will form part of your clinical evaluation. A competitor would not have access to your biocompatibility reports. So they would probably need access to that in order to claim equivalence. And there will be a number of other specifics depending on the nature and characteristics of your device. So I wouldn't be unduly worried about that. If people are making a Me Too device and hoping that a quick claim of equivalence is likely to work under the MDR, they're likely to be disappointed.
No more questions through the chat system, but we've had some more through email. So the next one is, I've been tasked with reviewing our existing CERs, and most of them seem fairly short and perhaps low on detail. How extensive should our CERs generally be?
Yeah, so I wonder if this is someone who, not necessarily, but somebody who's had class 1 devices approved under the MDD. Theoretically, all classes of device needed CERs under the MDD, but the fact that class 1 generally don't need to go through a notified body means that on occasion people didn't bother, or if they did, the CER will be quite a compact, quite a short document. Under the MDR, to do a clinical evaluation report properly, it becomes quite a weighty document. The shortest that we've done under the MDR is around 120 pages, and we've done several that have been well in excess of 500 pages. So a lot of that is about the depth of literature review that's needed, which is why we structure our medical team in the way that we do, which we'll come on to in a minute. So if you're looking at existing reports that are 20 pages, 30 pages, there's absolutely no way they're going to meet the MDR standard. Our template is 64 pages, and that's just the template. So the full document should be well in excess of that. So yeah, I think without knowing the specific device, it's hard to say a minimum, but if you're under 80 pages at an absolute floor, then you are missing important components, definitely. It's worth mentioning, as I touched on before, that one of the reasons we structure our medical writing team in the way we do is that they're all medical professionals. I was a medical professional for many years. I was a doctor in the UK. What we're doing is we're borrowing their ability to appraise clinical evidence through a very carefully constructed framework. And so you get objectivity and an ability to properly appraise and analyse evidence, which is absolutely central to meeting some of the requirements under the MDR. And so that's why we built our team in this way. And as a medical professional, it's my job to head that team. We also try and link people to doctors who've worked in the area, the field of their medical device, so they have no difficulty in understanding how the device will be used in practice and applied. And that extends to software as well. And so we've got a really broad range of medical professionals in our team, not just in the UK, but also in Europe, America, Hawaii, South Africa. It's a really international team that cover a really broad range of medical spheres. So it's likely that we'd have familiarity collectively with almost all devices. So that's why we structure our team in that way. It just means that we can help to meet these requirements under the MDR. So any more questions about clinical evaluation?
Any difference in undertaking clinical trials in a private clinic rather than NHS hospitals?
Right. So what this question really relates to through the lens of clinical evaluation is appraisal. Will a study done in a private clinic have the same weighting as a study that's done in an NHS hospital? And from a broad perspective, the answer is yes. If you think most healthcare in the US, for example, is private, and yet the US is home to really high quality clinical evidence. A proper appraisal would look at the potential for undue influence on the conduct of the study as one of the criteria. But there's nothing about it being conducted in a private clinic that automatically means that there'd be any undue influence, or indeed any reason why it would be a lower standard. Would need to demonstrate, or it would need to be demonstrated, that the patient population included in the study was representative of the population that would normally be exposed to the device. But in and of itself, as a criterion, that wouldn't represent an issue from the perspective of its applicability to clinical evaluation. That does link to the need to have a well-constructed appraisal framework that you can use, and that needs to be part of a clinical evaluation plan. So appraisal processes need to be set out in advance. Personally, I wouldn't use setting as an appraisal criterion. I'd focus on things such as suitability of sample size, whether or not any of the authors have a financial link to the manufacturer, and other things, clinical significance of the results, and so on. So that wouldn't normally be a criterion.
There's a follow-on question from a previous email that I think it's been touched on, but just expands a little bit more on the complexities of the CERs, and it's how much time they've asked how much time they should set aside within their projects for writing a CER.
Yeah, so important to plan ahead. So generally speaking, when we do CERs, we allocate between 6 weeks and 2 months for the process. That includes getting all the information together, doing an initial review to make sure everything's there, and then going off and doing the writing. But it's worth remembering that we use a team of people to perform clinical evaluations. So if you're someone working on your own, then that process will take longer, perhaps 3 months. And that time frame includes revisions and internal review and so on. But we do offer an expedite service if people are really under a tight timeline. But if you're working on your own and you've got less than 4 weeks, you're going to be really, really, really pushed to do it properly. And again, a big reason for that is the literature review. It just takes a lot of time. Does your service include finding a clinic for evaluation of a medical device? We are launching a collateral service which you can think of almost as a dating agency between hospitals that want to have research conducted at their sites and medical device manufacturers who want to conduct research. And that's called Clinical Investigators. I'm sure Richard will put a link in the chat. This is a new part of our business. If you're interested in learning more about that service, then you can certainly get in contact with us and we can give you more information. It's not part of our clinical evaluation service because really, if you're going to conduct a clinical evaluation, you should already have the clinical data available. Clinical evaluation is an analysis and appraisal of data that already exists. And so that would come before the stage of a clinical evaluation. Okay, so final thing then is just to say, we've put a lot of free information on our website, not just about clinical evaluation, but about a full range of topics under the MDR. So do check out our compliance guide. Again, I'm sure Richard will be kind enough to put a link. And we also have an extensive range of resources that are free to download, a range of articles and white papers covering various topics, from an overview of the MDR itself through to post-market surveillance and a number of other topics. We're launching a new service later this month called our Academy, and the Academy is designed so that it's more efficient than outsourcing of various activities. And so it will focus on risk management, quality management, and technical documents. And this means that if you're looking for support in producing MDR technical documents or a risk management system that complies with ISO 14971, it's far more cost effective. I mean, less than 10% of the cost of outsourcing that to a consultancy. Instead, you get templates, you get a full living, breathing document management system, and an extensive course of educational resources, so you know absolutely what to do. And you get it all for a monthly fee that can be cancelled at any time. So there's no risk involved with it. So if you're interested in learning more about our Academy, which is, let's say, launching soon, then do get in touch with us and we can provide you with more information. But if you want to talk to us about our clinical evaluation services, you don't need to feel under any obligation. Just contact us at the usual email address, that's contact@manchestersystems.co.uk, or give us a call on the office number. More than happy to speak with you. And yeah, we'd like to hear from you. So really, it just remains to say thanks very much for joining our clinic today. You know where we are, so reach out if you need us, and hope to speak with some of you soon.